already have something to really fight
It's
about.
probably going to be an hour. I have one more question, but I do want to stay on the topic of UBI and balancing out the equation as far as because I think it could be looked at as a libertarian topic and it could be looked at as a socialist topic depending on what other social programs the country has if it's on a national level.
Sure.
I think what Alaska has right now leans more towards the socialist side because we have a very loaded state government.
False. No, it's false. I mean, compared to almost every other developed country in the world, we actually have very little social services. So,
the state of Alaska particularly.
The United States as a whole, and the state of Alaska as a political entity in that, where we don't have particularly, look, I worked at Alaska Legal Services. It is not easy to be on food stamps or to be on Medicaid. You're absolutely right. You have to deal with these bureaucrats that have control over your life. And you have to, and with things like food stamps, you're time barred. I mean, you have 3 months and then some people are kicked off. So we actually do not have a super generous welfare state in this state or in the United States. But the libertarians have convinced a lot of people, by shifting the Overton window, that actually there's this huge entitlement class. That's actually not the case. It's very hard to sort of live on the equivalent of welfare in this state or anywhere else. So and the idea we have a bloated state government, adjusted for inflation, we spend less per capita now than we have at any point since the 1980s. So I don't think that's the case either. Of course, it is expensive to live in Alaska and to have basic services in Alaska. There's no question. But the thing that sets the United States and Alaska apart from the rest of the developed world is we have extremely low taxes. We have very low taxes relative to the rest of the world.
Well, I would first do my cross comparison between Alaska and other states instead of Alaska and Sweden.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's a more fair comparison to make. I do think we spend too much money here, and our state government is too big.
What specifically would you cut?
Well, don't quote me on the number. Don't ask me to quote the numbers, but I've seen the numbers, and the amount of government spending per citizen, per resident in the state, I think is very high compared to other states, not to Sweden, but to other states. And the reason for that is that when the state of Alaska was admitted to the Union, we had this massive amount of land, small population. We set up the state to basically to fund and administer government from the center to all over. They did put Article 10 into the state constitution, which is there to try to raise maturing communities through pupillage to maturity and then become self-governing independent communities. But, we still are really sustaining communities all across Alaska, including this university, from a central point out into the edges. And that we haven't really yet broken out of that. And I think oil factors very large in that story, why it is. We did it because we could. I think a much better and happier state would see communities that mature and develop and have diversified economies and can support themselves and so on, instead of having all the parts of the state basically lifted up from government services and funding and breaks and PFD dividends and everything coming from a central point. I mean, our university says that I'm part of this system. We have one of the highest rates of dependency on state appropriations in the country, right? And it shouldn't be that way. But why is it? Well, because of the way the system was set up. And all of state government is kind of like that. I think that's why it's so expensive on a per person basis, as opposed to other states where communities are more self-supporting and they're more frugal as a result. But that's what I would like us to get to. I think overall we would be far more prosperous. Our economy would be far more diversified if we no longer expect the state to kind of do that job of lifting everybody up.
But the state has always been the entity, and I think is the only realistic entity in which to do that sort of in-gathering and then redistribution. And you say like a centralized point. I think people hear that and they think it's Anchorage or Juneau. But actually the wealth of this state is created mostly in rural Alaska. It comes from the North Slope, it comes from the Red Dog Mine, it comes from the fish that are along the coast.
Right.
So, I mean, another model is the wealth stays there and doesn't come to Anchorage or doesn't go to Juneau. You know, the folks at the North Slope fully control the oil and are able to buy and sell it and have property taxes and all the rest. But I don't think that was really an equitable model either, because it's arbitrary whether you happen to be sitting on a plot of land that has a huge amount of oil or whether you don't. And so we created a state constitution, and we use things like ANCSA with the 7I funds that do help sort of bring in and redistribute that wealth. And I think it's sort of an inescapable model when you have a state with this kind of population, with these kind of resources, and with this kind of geographic challenge, right? But to get to your point about, what could we do to maybe reduce, maybe this was your point, some dependence on the oil and some dependence on the extraction. Part of it is we are the only state in the country without any kind of broad-based tax, right? We're the only state where that's the case. Forget comparing us to Sweden, compare us to Texas. If we had an oil system, and they have either a sales tax or an income tax. You know more about Texas than I do. They have a sales tax, right? Yeah. I prefer an income tax because I think sales taxes are a little bit more aggressive.
I'm with you. I agree.
Either way, you have to be able to capture more of the wealth and then and also have skin in the game, right? Alaska.
The skin in the game argument is a compelling one. I think that's the most compelling one.
Yeah, and this was Governor Hammond, the last Republican my parents ever voted for, was a visionary in a lot of ways. He opposed getting rid of the income tax, and eventually he went along with it. But I think his insight was we'd have the PFD that would basically hold Alaskans harmless. And then the folks that came in to work on the North Slope, to come wherever, they would pay an income tax, and we would pay some small income tax as well. And in that way, you wouldn't have this fundamental break that you've seen with a lot of people between the government and the services provided, and like you were saying, the sort of the fact that I am myself contributing to it, right? That I have some financial incentives to. Maybe it's to reduce costs. I actually don't think it would be. When you put it in front of people, like say where I'm from in Cordova, would you rather have an income tax or a ferry system? I think most people would say, I'd be willing to pay an income tax that meant I had a ferry system. Because without the ferry system, my small rural community cannot function. And that's the case with a lot of places in Alaska where there are these programs. The school, where I lived in Eagle, the school is the center of the community. And that's the case for a lot of villages. If you destroy state support for the schools, some of these villages will actually wither and die and go away. And I know that some folks that live on the road system say, well, so be it, they shouldn't live out there. But I think that gets to something that's fundamental about the soul of the state of Alaska. And rural communities are very much a part of that.
No, I understand. So let me, I don't want to debate with you about, whether or not we should cut those schools in those communities. What I'd like to debate is how do we get to a vision that I think we could both get behind. What I would like to see the state of, Lord willing, the river don't rise. I'm still here. We're both here for years to come, and hopefully we can have some influence in this debate. But what I would like to see Alaska become is the richest, freest, and also because we missed a lot of the harshest lessons of the Industrial Revolution, we can still be the greenest state of the union. I mean, we ought to be able to teach the rest of the world how to live in the Arctic and thrive and prosper while living, and doing so without harming our environment, but living together with it. And have a population here that is numerous, but it's not overwhelming the average, because we can fit them here, but we're also preserving the beauty of this place and not damaging it. Well, we could have 50 million people here and not even put a dent in this. But seriously, that is how I'd like to. We are right in the middle of international trade routes, right in the middle of fiber lines that meet offshores that connect the Americas, Asia, and Europe. I mean, there is a ton that we ought to be able to do with this place economically. That's what I would like to get to. And I would like to get to a point where our communities are vibrant, thriving economically. And the debate is not going to be about whether or not the state should lift up these rural school systems because they're the soul of the state, and whether or not we should cut them or make this expense, but rather have communities that are able to support them on their own because they're wealthy, happy, prosperous, and self-governing. And that's where I think and so the question ought to be, I don't like the debate about, oh, should we, cut all these people off of the state government? It's toast, and this person's a demon and a devil because they want to cut them off, and then this person is profligate and wants to waste the public treasury. No, let's start with the vision and then figure out how do we get there? Because I think a lot of people like that vision of our state exporting republicanism and trade and wealth back to the lower 48 and show how citizens, we are so hyper diverse here in Anchorage, and we could show the rest of the country how we can be prosperous, thriving, patriotic American citizens. We want that, don't we?
I don't disagree with a lot of what you said in theory. In practice, the way it's worked in Alaska, I'll say one thing. It doesn't really matter whether or not you want to support those rural schools. There's a constitutional duty to do so, right? And it's been litigated. You have to constitutionally fund those rural schools, right? I would say also, I just want to make sure we bring it up before we close here.
Sure.
When you're talking about the greenest state, and you're talking about the state where we have self-governing bodies, we know it can be done because it was done by the indigenous people here for 10,000 years.
Right.
So I think the indigenous community has to be a key part of that vision. The problem is now, it is, but there are...
The native corporations...
Well, native corporations are part of it, but there's also the tribal entities, and a lot of folks who feel that some of the extractive industries are counter to what they see as the long-term vision of the state, right? And so that gets back to diversifying away from some of those extractive industries too. But again, the idea that we should be prosperous, the idea that we should be largely self-governing, the idea that people shouldn't be completely reliant on the state, I don't think you're going to get much pushback on any of that. But the practical reality on the ground right now in a lot of rural communities is that the state has been the primary funder of the schools, for example. They have a constitutional duty to do so. And that needs to continue if we want to have a functioning state, because ultimately what you're talking about is a lot of really acute political tension if you try to do what the governor just tried to do, which was very quickly devastate all of those communities. Whether or not that was his intention, I don't think it was. Some people think he's actually trying to actively depopulate the state. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I just think that his particular vision is driven by something fundamentally counter to the way the state was originally structured and the way the constitutional law of the state exists. And in the future, again,
Of course, that policy debate shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of the legislative session. We should be thinking about that long-term vision and thinking about what policy steps we need to take to get there.
Yeah.
So that we're not just debating about. That's why I'm saying I want to get away from. I want to solve that policy difference of agree. Get that taken care of, and then let's move to how to improve our state. Because frankly, our growth has been pathetic. We have fallen so short of where we should be as a state. And we don't look ourselves in the mirror enough and say that we have fallen short and we need to improve. Because we are not using all the assets that we have here to become with that.
I didn't agree with everything Governor Bill Walker did or the way he did it. And I think he made some pretty key mistakes politically. But I think he was willing to have that conversation you're talking about now. And he was trying to. And I'm hoping that Governor Kevin Meyer will be too.
I thought Walker, regardless of what you like or don't like about his policy solutions, the man had guts.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
He actually tried to.
Right, and I, like I said, I didn't share all the same political beliefs that he did, but his obsession in life was to try to build a natural gas pipeline. Yeah. And you could agree whether or not that was the right policy, but I think it fits into what you're talking about. That was what he wanted to accomplish. He wanted to do something that would have lasted longer than just the taps, right? Yeah. And he was willing to make some really tough political calls to try to get us somewhere near a balanced budget. Yeah. Unfortunately, there was obviously, what happened there.
Yeah.
Well, we found something to argue about.
Yeah.
Although I'm still not sure how far apart we are.
Yeah, I definitely.